February 14, 1943, dawned cold over the Tunisian desert, and with it came a reckoning that would shake the confidence of an entire army. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood atop a rocky outcrop near Sidi Bou Zid, his Afrika Korps binoculars scanning the chaotic American positions sprawling across the valley below. The legendary Desert Fox had spent months hearing whispered assessments from his intelligence officers about these newcomers to the North African theater, these Americans who had arrived with gleaming equipment and untested resolve. What he saw that morning confirmed his darkest suspicions: green troops, scattered defenses, and commanders who seemed to be playing at war rather than waging it. The German general had earned his fearsome reputation through audacity and tactical brilliance across 2 years of brutal desert warfare. He had pushed the British Eighth Army to the brink of collapse at Gazala, captured Tobruk in a lightning assault, and driven deep into Egypt before finally being halted at El Alamein. His panzer divisions were legendary, their commanders seasoned by countless engagements against the battle-hardened British and Commonwealth forces. Now, as 1943 began, Rommel found himself squeezed between Bernard Montgomery's pursuing army in the east and the untested Allied forces that had landed in Operation Torch to the west. The Americans represented an unknown variable in his calculations, but from everything his reconnaissance had revealed, they appeared to be the weaker link in the Allied chain. Intelligence reports flowing into Rommel's headquarters painted a picture of inexperienced officers making elementary mistakes. American units were spread too thin across impossible distances, their positions poorly coordinated, their reconnaissance inadequate. The Wehrmacht's experienced observers noted that American soldiers seemed more concerned with creature comforts than tactical soundness, bringing luxuries into the field that no German soldier would have dreamed of possessing. According to assessments documented in military archives and later referenced in historians' accounts of the North African campaign, Rommel's staff characterized the Americans as soft and unprepared for the realities of mechanized warfare in the desert. The field marshal himself shared this assessment with a certain aristocratic disdain. He had faced the British across the western desert for 2 years, respecting their dogged determination even as he outmaneuvered them time and again. The Australians he considered fierce fighters, the New Zealanders tenacious, the Indian troops courageous, but Americans? They struck him as a nation of civilians playing at soldiering, armed with excellent equipment they barely understood how to use effectively. Their doctrines seemed sound enough on paper, clearly borrowed from European military thinking, but doctrine meant nothing without the iron discipline and combat experience to implement it under fire. What Rommel could not have known as he planned his assault that frigid February morning was that he was about to teach the American army the most brutal lesson of its young war. The coming battle at Kasserine Pass would shatter American units, expose fatal flaws in leadership and training, and send shockwaves all the way back to Washington. It would be a catastrophic defeat, a national humiliation that would dominate headlines and congressional hearings. Yet from those ashes would emerge something the Desert Fox had not anticipated, something that would gradually force him to completely reassess his contemptuous view of the American fighting man. February 15, 1943, brought terror to the untested American Second Corps as Rommel unleashed his veteran 5th Panzer Army in a coordinated assault designed to destroy the scattered Allied forces before they could consolidate their positions. The German attack struck with devastating precision against the American defenses at Sidi Bou Zid, where Colonel Thomas Drake's forces found themselves horrifically outmatched. The thunder of approaching panzers echoed across the desert floor as Mark IV tanks and the feared Tiger tanks rolled forward in practiced formations, their experienced crews having perfected the art of coordinated armor assault through countless engagements against British forces. The American defenders fought with desperate courage, but courage alone proved insufficient against Rommel's tactical mastery. Within hours, the German armor had encircled Drake's position, cutting off retreat routes and systematically destroying the American tank battalions that attempted to relieve the beleaguered garrison. The American M3 medium tanks, already obsolete by European standards, proved woefully inadequate against the German armor. Their 37mm guns could barely scratch the frontal armor of the advancing panzers, while German return fire punched through American armor with contemptuous ease. By day's end, the battlefield was littered with burning American vehicles, their crews dead or captured, the survivors streaming eastward in disorganized retreat. Rommel watched the rout with grim satisfaction, his initial assessment apparently confirmed. The Americans broke under pressure, their formations dissolving into chaos, their commanders unable to coordinate an effective response. German after-action reports, later preserved in military archives, noted with clinical precision how American units abandoned equipment, failed to maintain communication, and demonstrated a shocking lack of battlefield discipline. The field marshal's contempt deepened as he observed American prisoners being marched to the rear, many still in shock, some weeping openly, others staring blankly at the scale of their defeat. The German offensive rolled forward with gathering momentum, exploiting the gaps torn in American lines. Rommel's forces pushed through Gafsa, then turned north toward the vital mountain passes that controlled access to the Allied supply depots near Tebessa. The Americans fell back in disorder, attempting to establish defensive positions, but lacking the experience to recognize good ground or the training to fortify it properly. German reconnaissance units reported American soldiers abandoning perfectly defensible positions after minimal pressure, fleeing at the first sign of German armor rather than standing to fight. On February 19, 1943, Rommel's forces reached Kasserine Pass itself, a narrow defile through the rugged Atlas Mountains that represented the last defensible barrier before the crucial supply bases. Here, the retreating Americans attempted to make a stand, hastily throwing together a defensive line composed of remnants from shattered units. Reinforcements rushed forward from rear areas, and whatever armor could be salvaged from the disaster. The defenders represented a desperate mixture of infantry, engineers, artillery crews, and even rear echelon support personnel pressed into combat roles, many of them firing weapons in anger for the first time in their lives. The German assault on Kasserine Pass began with an artillery barrage that shattered the makeshift American defenses, followed by coordinated infantry and armor attacks that probed for weaknesses in the hastily established line. For 2 days, the battle raged across the rocky slopes and narrow valley floor, the Americans giving ground stubbornly but unable to halt the German advance. Rommel's veterans pushed forward with the confidence born of countless victories, expecting the American line to collapse completely as it had at Sidi Bouzid. The Desert Fox prepared to exploit what he anticipated would be a complete breakthrough, positioning his reserves to pursue the fleeing Americans all the way to their supply bases. February 20th, 1943 marked the critical moment when Rommel's contemptuous certainty about American combat effectiveness began to encounter unexpected complications, though he did not yet recognize the significance of what he was witnessing. As German forces pushed deeper into Kasserine Pass, they encountered resistance that, while still inadequate by Wehrmacht standards, showed disturbing flashes of competence and determination. American artillery, which had been poorly coordinated in earlier engagements, began delivering increasingly effective fire missions that disrupted German assault formations. The gunners of the American field artillery battalions, many of them college-educated volunteers with strong mathematical aptitudes, quickly mastered the technical aspects of their weapons, even if broader tactical coordination remained elusive. Individual American units, though still green and prone to panic, occasionally demonstrated surprising tenacity when properly positioned and led. A battalion of infantry from the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, that had seen limited action in the Operation Torch landings, held a crucial ridgeline against repeated German assaults, their defensive fire disciplined and effective. Tank destroyer crews, operating the new 10 vehicles with their powerful 3-inch guns, learned through brutal experience to use terrain and camouflage to ambush advancing panzers, achieving their first significant kills against German armor. These were isolated successes amid a broader picture of defeat, but they represented something Rommel had not expected from troops he had dismissed as hopelessly incompetent. The field marshal's operational planning now faced an uncomfortable reality. The American collapse he had anticipated was not materializing quickly enough. His intelligence had suggested that breaking through Kasserine Pass would trigger a general rout, allowing his mobile forces to race 50 miles east to Tebessa, capturing the massive Allied supply dumps there and potentially destabilizing the entire North African front. Instead, the Americans, despite their losses and continued retreats, maintained some semblance of organization. They fell back to new positions, reorganized shattered units, and continued resisting with equipment and determination that slowed the German timetable. British reinforcements began arriving to bolster the American defenses. Veteran units from Montgomery's 8th Army rushing west to shore up their faltering allies. The British commanders, while deeply concerned about American performance, also noted qualities in the American soldiers that suggested potential beneath the inexperience. The Americans absorbed casualties that would have broken some European armies, yet continued to man their positions. They demonstrated remarkable adaptability, with junior officers and even sergeants taking command when their superiors fell, improvising solutions to tactical problems even without proper training. According to military historians' later analyses of the campaign, documented in works examining the North African theater, the American soldiers' individual initiative and willingness to take responsibility distinguished him from soldiers in more rigidly hierarchical armies. Rommel found himself forced to commit reserves earlier than planned, his advance slowing as American resistance, while still inadequate, proved more stubborn than anticipated. The logistical realities of his position also began weighing heavily on his calculations. His forces were operating at the extreme end of supply lines that stretched back across hundreds of miles of desert, while the Americans, despite their retreat, remained close to their supply bases. German fuel stocks ran low, ammunition expenditure exceeded projections, and vehicle maintenance became increasingly problematic in the harsh desert environment. On February 22, 1943, Rommel made the difficult decision to suspend his offensive and begin withdrawing his forces back toward more defensible positions. His units had pushed through Kasserine Pass, had inflicted devastating casualties on the Americans, and had captured thousands of prisoners along with mountains of equipment. By any conventional measure, the battle represented a significant German tactical victory. Yet strategically, Rommel had failed to achieve his primary objectives: the destruction of American forces as a coherent fighting entity and the capture of the Allied supply bases. March 1, 1943 found Erwin Rommel in his headquarters near the Mareth Line, reviewing intelligence reports and after-action assessments with a troubled expression that his staff had rarely seen on the Desert Fox's weathered face. The American Second Corps, bloodied and humiliated at Kasserine Pass, had not disintegrated as Rommel had confidently predicted. Instead, the defeated American units were being rapidly reorganized under new leadership, with General George Patton taking command and implementing sweeping changes to training, discipline, and tactical doctrine. German reconnaissance aircraft photographing American positions reported something unexpected. Rather than collapsing into demoralization, the American forces appeared to be intensifying their training activities and aggressively patrolling forward of their lines. The Field Marshal's intelligence officers brought him reports that painted a picture of an army learning at remarkable speed from its catastrophic defeat. The Americans had cashiered incompetent commanders at all levels, promoting aggressive leaders who demonstrated tactical acumen regardless of seniority. They had reorganized their scattered units into more cohesive formations, corrected the fatal dispersion that had left them vulnerable to German attacks, and implemented new defensive doctrines based on lessons learned in blood at Kasserine Pass. Equipment losses were being replaced at a rate that astonished German observers, with new tanks, artillery pieces, and vehicles flowing into American units faster than Rommel could replace his own losses. What disturbed Rommel most profoundly was the evidence of systematic analysis and adaptation. The American army possessed a cultural characteristic that European armies often lacked: a willingness to openly acknowledge failure, analyze mistakes without regard to preserving institutional pride, and rapidly implement corrective measures. Staff officers who visited the American sector under flags of truce for prisoner exchanges reported seeing intensive after-action reviews, where junior officers freely criticized their superiors' decisions and discussed alternative approaches without fear of punishment. This struck the Germans as unmilitary, even chaotic, yet it produced results with disturbing efficiency. Intelligence reports documented in military archives from this period indicate that Rommel began expressing private concerns about American potential to his closest subordinates. The Americans had fought poorly at Kasserine Pass by Wehrmacht standards, but they had fought, and some units had fought well, despite impossible circumstances. More importantly, they demonstrated no sign of the psychological collapse that usually followed such devastating defeats. German soldiers who had experienced the Eastern Front noted with professional interest that American prisoners, unlike Soviet prisoners in similar circumstances, maintained their military bearing and showed no sign of the beaten-down hopelessness that characterized truly broken armies. The field marshal also confronted uncomfortable logistical realities. America's industrial capacity, which he had intellectually understood but not truly appreciated, was beginning to manifest itself on the battlefield. Every destroyed American tank was replaced by 2, every lost artillery piece by 3. Meanwhile, Rommel's panzer divisions, ground down by 2 years of continuous combat, received replacement vehicles in dribs and drabs when they received them at all. The qualitative superiority his forces enjoyed in training and experience was being slowly eroded by quantitative factors he could not overcome. German patrols probing American positions in early March 1943 encountered a different opponent than they had faced 3 weeks earlier. American sentries were more alert, defensive positions better sighted, reaction times faster. When German reconnaissance elements attempted to raid American outposts, they met with coordinated defensive fire and rapid reinforcement that made such operations costly rather than routine. The Americans were learning, and they were learning with a speed that military professionals found remarkable. Rommel's strategic situation continued deteriorating throughout early March. Montgomery's 8th Army applied increasing pressure from the east, while the reorganized American and French forces threatened from the west. The field marshal found himself trapped in Tunisia with no realistic hope of evacuation or reinforcement, fighting a defensive campaign against enemies who grew stronger daily while his own forces weakened. In this context, the improving competence of American forces represented more than a tactical concern. It suggested that the Wehrmacht faced an opponent whose potential remained largely unrealized, but whose trajectory pointed toward eventual dominance. March 17, 1943 dawned with deceptive calm over the rocky terrain near El Getter, where Patton's reorganized Second Corps had established defensive positions blocking the road to Gafsa. Rommel, now serving under Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who commanded Axis forces in Tunisia, planned a counteroffensive designed to disrupt Allied preparations for Montgomery's assault on the Mareth Line. The 10th Panzer Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite formations, received orders to attack the American positions and drive them back from the vital road network. German commanders approached the operation with confidence tempered by recent experience. The Americans would likely fight better than at Kasserine Pass, but superior German training and tactical skill should prevail against such inexperienced opponents. The German attack commenced with the usual professional efficiency: panzer formations advancing in coordination with mechanized infantry, artillery preparation suppressing suspected American positions, reconnaissance elements probing for weaknesses in the defensive line. What the Germans encountered shocked them. American artillery responded with devastating accuracy and coordination, catching German assault formations in carefully planned killing zones. Forward observers, now properly trained and equipped with effective communications, directed fire with a precision that rivaled anything the Wehrmacht had experienced on other fronts. The concentrated American artillery fire shattered the German assault before it could develop momentum, forcing the panzers to seek cover and disrupting the careful coordination that made German combined arms tactics so effective. American infantry, dug into well-prepared positions on commanding terrain, held their fire until German troops closed to effective range, then delivered disciplined volleys that stopped the assault cold. The same soldiers who had fled in panic at Kasserine Pass now stood their ground under heavy fire, their training and reorganization transforming them into competent defensive fighters. Tank destroyer battalions, positioned in carefully camouflaged ambush sites, allowed German armor to advance into kill zones before opening fire with their powerful guns, destroying multiple panzers in quick succession before withdrawing to alternate positions. The 10th Panzer Division, accustomed to breaking through defensive lines, found itself stopped dead by an American defense that functioned with unexpected competence. German after-action reports preserved in military archives expressed surprise at the transformation in American combat effectiveness. The same army that had collapsed at Kasserine Pass 6 weeks earlier now fought with coordination and determination that frustrated German tactical excellence. The Americans still made mistakes, still displayed their inexperience in various ways, but the gap between Wehrmacht proficiency and American capability had narrowed dramatically in a remarkably short time. For 3 days, the battle raged around El Getter, the Germans unable to break through American defenses despite repeated attempts. Patton's forces, while not achieving the tactical sophistication of veteran Wehrmacht units, demonstrated that they had learned fundamental lessons about defensive warfare. They used terrain effectively, maintained communications under fire, coordinated supporting arms properly, and most importantly, stood their ground when attacked. The psychological transformation was as significant as the tactical improvements. These were no longer scared recruits breaking under their first taste of combat, but soldiers who had experienced the worst defeat imaginable and emerged determined to prove themselves. On March 23, 1943, the German offensive ground to a halt, having failed to achieve its objectives and suffered unexpectedly heavy casualties in the attempt. The 10th Panzer Division withdrew to its starting positions, its commanders filing reports that painted a sobering picture of improved American combat capabilities. The invincible Wehrmacht mystique, so carefully cultivated through years of victories, had encountered an opponent who refused to accept inevitable defeat. Rommel, though no longer directly commanding the assault, received detailed briefings on the El Getter fighting. The reports forced him to confront a reality he had resisted accepting: the American army, while still green and inexperienced compared to Wehrmacht veterans, possessed qualities that made them dangerous opponents. Their ability to rapidly incorporate lessons learned, their logistical superiority, their technological competence, and their stubborn determination represented a combination that traditional military thinking had not adequately accounted for. April 1, 1943 found Erwin Rommel aboard a transport aircraft flying from Tunisia to Germany, having been ordered home by Hitler for health reasons and to brief the High Command on the North African situation. As the Desert Fox watched the African coastline recede beneath him, he carried with him a radically transformed assessment of American military capabilities, an assessment that would have seemed impossible 3 months earlier. The man who had contemptuously dismissed Americans as soft and unprepared now found himself composing mental reports that described them as the most dangerous long-term threat facing the Wehrmacht. During his final weeks in Tunisia, Rommel had witnessed the continued evolution of American combat effectiveness. Operations conducted in late March demonstrated that Patton's Second Corps had mastered basic combined arms warfare with remarkable speed. American infantry coordinated effectively with armor and artillery, their attacks displaying increasing sophistication despite continued tactical errors that betrayed their inexperience. More significantly, the Americans showed no sign of the psychological fragility Rommel had initially attributed to them. They absorbed casualties without breaking, learned from mistakes without losing confidence, and displayed an aggressive spirit that reminded him more of Russian soldiers on the Eastern Front than the cautious British he had fought in the Western Desert. The Field Marshal's reassessment extended beyond tactical considerations to strategic implications that deeply troubled him. America's industrial capacity, now fully mobilized for war production, was generating military equipment on a scale that defied comprehension. Intelligence reports indicated that American factories were producing thousands of tanks monthly, numbers that exceeded the entire German tank inventory on all fronts. Aircraft production showed similar disparities, with American aviation manufacturing achieving outputs that made Luftwaffe production appear trivial by comparison. This quantitative advantage, combined with improving quality as American military equipment incorporated combat lessons, represented an insurmountable challenge for Germany's overstretched war economy. Rommel's staff officers had compiled detailed analyses of American military characteristics based on 3 months of combat experience in Tunisia. These assessments, later preserved in German military archives and referenced by historians studying the North African campaign, painted a nuanced picture of American strengths and weaknesses. The reports noted that American soldiers, while initially poor at defensive warfare, excelled at offensive operations once they gained experience. Their doctrine emphasized mobility and firepower over the careful coordination that characterized German operations, accepting higher casualties in exchange for maintaining operational tempo. This approach, wasteful by Wehrmacht standards, proved effective when supported by American logistical abundance. The German analyses also identified cultural factors that distinguished American forces from European armies. American soldiers displayed remarkable individual initiative, with enlisted men and junior officers willing to take independent action when separated from higher command. This contrasted sharply with Wehrmacht doctrine, which emphasized tight control and coordination, and with Soviet practice, which relied on centralized direction. The American approach produced chaos in the early battles, but once basic tactical competence was achieved, this initiative became a significant advantage. German commanders found American units unpredictable, likely to attempt unexpected maneuvers or unconventional solutions that violated standard military practice, but sometimes achieved surprising success. Rommel's personal notes from this period, later examined by military historians, reveal his growing conviction that Germany could not win a protracted war against the Allied coalition. The American factor changed the strategic equation fundamentally. While individual American units might still be inferior to comparable Wehrmacht formations in tactical sophistication, the combination of American industrial capacity, technological competence, learning speed, and stubborn determination created an opponent that would eventually overwhelm German qualitative advantages through sheer scale and persistence. The Desert Fox arrived in Germany prepared to deliver uncomfortable truths to Hitler and the High Command. The Americans were not the soft, incompetent opponents that propaganda and prejudice had portrayed. They were a nation of technically skilled civilians transforming themselves into competent soldiers with remarkable speed, supported by an industrial base that made their eventual victory inevitable unless Germany found some way to achieve a negotiated peace before American strength fully manifested itself. May 7, 1943 marked the final German surrender in Tunisia. With over 250,000 Axis prisoners marching into Allied captivity, including the remnants of Rommel's Afrika Korps fighting under different commanders since his departure, the Desert Fox watched events unfold from Germany, his warnings about American capabilities seemingly vindicated by the campaign's conclusion. The American army that had been humiliated at Kasserine Pass in February had evolved by May into a competent fighting force that contributed significantly to the Axis defeat in North Africa. This transformation, accomplished in just 3 months of intensive combat, represented the most rapid military learning curve Rommel had witnessed in his long career. German officers interrogated after Tunisia's fall provided additional perspective on American military evolution. They described an opponent who approached warfare differently than European armies, treating combat operations almost like engineering problems to be solved through systematic analysis and application of resources. Americans collected data obsessively, conducted detailed after-action reviews following every engagement, identified deficiencies in equipment and doctrine through formal feedback mechanisms, and implemented corrections with a speed that traditional military bureaucracies could not match. This systematic approach to warfare, combining scientific methodology with military operations, represented something fundamentally new in military history. The Wehrmacht's professional officers recognized that American advantages extended beyond industrial capacity to include organizational culture and educational systems. American officers, many of them civilian professionals in uniform, brought expertise from engineering, business management, and scientific fields that translated surprisingly well to military operations. They analyzed logistics with actuarial precision, approached maintenance as a systematic process rather than ad hoc repair, and treated training as a continuous improvement cycle. These civilians-turned-soldiers lacked the aristocratic military traditions of European officer corps, but they compensated through technical competence and practical problem-solving skills. Rommel's observations about American adaptability influenced Wehrmacht thinking about future operations against Allied forces. German commanders planning the defense of Italy and preparation for the anticipated invasion of France studied American tactical patterns identified in Tunisia. The analyses revealed consistent American preferences for overwhelming firepower over maneuver, for systematic reduction of defensive positions over infiltration tactics, for direct approaches over elaborate deception. These patterns made American operations predictable to experienced Wehrmacht tacticians, but the scale of American firepower and material superiority often rendered this predictability irrelevant. The field marshal's transformed perspective on American capabilities emerged from professional respect rather than ideological conversion. Rommel remained loyal to Germany and continued serving the Nazi regime despite growing doubts about Hitler's leadership and the war's outcome. His reassessment of American soldiers reflected purely military judgment, a professional soldier recognizing worthy opponents whose strengths demanded serious consideration rather than dismissive contempt. The Americans had proven themselves capable of learning from defeat, adapting their doctrine and implementing improvements with remarkable speed qualities that any military professional had to respect regardless of political considerations. Intelligence assessments compiled by German staff officers in mid-1943 predicted that American combat effectiveness would continue, improving as their army gained experience. The soldiers who fought in Tunisia would form the core of veteran units that would lead future Allied operations in Sicily, Italy, and eventually the invasion of France. Each campaign would provide additional combat experience, further refining American tactics and validating their doctrine. Meanwhile, American training establishments would incorporate North African lessons into instruction for new units, ensuring that the entire American military benefited from the experiences of those first formations that fought the Afrika Korps. Rommel's colleagues in the Wehrmacht High Command received his assessments with mixed reactions. Some officers, particularly those without direct experience fighting Americans, dismissed his warnings as defeatist pessimism from a commander whose African defeats had left him demoralized. Others, especially those who had served in Tunisia or reviewed the detailed after-action reports, recognized the validity of Rommel's concerns. The American army represented a fundamentally different challenge than anything the Wehrmacht had previously encountered, combining Soviet-scale resources with British organizational competence and a uniquely American approach to systematic problem-solving. June 6, 1944, witnessed the vindication of Rommel's evolved assessment of American military capabilities when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in military history. The Desert Fox, now commanding German forces defending France's Atlantic coast, watched American soldiers demonstrate on Norman beaches the transformation that had begun in Tunisian wadis 16 months earlier. The inexperienced troops who had broken at Kasserine Pass had become the hardened veterans who stormed Omaha Beach under withering fire, refusing to retreat despite horrific casualties, displaying the same stubborn determination that had emerged at El Gueter, but now refined through campaigns in Sicily and Italy. Rommel's defensive preparations for the anticipated invasion reflected his hard-won knowledge of American operational characteristics. He had argued for positioning panzer reserves close to the invasion beaches, recognizing that American firepower superiority and air dominance would make it impossible to move armored formations once Allied forces established themselves ashore. His strategic disagreements with other German commanders stemmed partly from his unique experience fighting Americans in Africa. He understood, as few other Wehrmacht officers did, that American material advantages would overwhelm German tactical excellence if given time to fully deploy. The American soldiers landing in Normandy bore little resemblance to the raw troops who had fled German attacks in Tunisia. They moved with professional competence, coordinated complex operations efficiently, and displayed tactical sophistication that would have seemed impossible based on their Kasserine past performance. The transformation Rommel had witnessed beginning in North Africa had continued through subsequent campaigns, each battle adding experience and refining skills. The American 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, that had fought at Kasserine Pass, led the assault on Omaha Beach with veteran confidence, their soldiers demonstrating the tactical proficiency that only comes from extensive combat experience. German defenders in Normandy encountered the fully developed American way of warfare that Rommel had first observed emerging in Tunisia. American forces advanced behind walls of artillery fire that pulverized German defensive positions. Supported by airstrikes that made daytime movement suicidal for Wehrmacht forces, supplied by logistical networks that seemed immune to disruption, when German forces mounted counterattacks, they ran into defensive firepower that stopped assaults cold, the Americans having learned through bitter experience how to coordinate all supporting arms into integrated defensive systems. The tactical sophistication that Wehrmacht officers had taken for granted as their professional birthright now appeared in American operations, albeit executed with characteristically American emphasis on material abundance over elegant efficiency. Rommel's July 1944 involvement in the failed plot against Hitler ended his military career, though his forced suicide came later that year. The Desert Fox did not live to see the American army he had first encountered in Tunisia drive across France, smash through the German Ardennes counteroffensive, and finally push into Germany itself. Yet his evolved assessment of American military capabilities, initially formed through the harsh lessons of North African combat, proved prophetic. The American army that entered Germany in 1945 bore the institutional knowledge and combat experience that Rommel had recognized emerging from the crucible of Kasserine Pass. Military historians analyzing the North African campaign have consistently noted the remarkable transformation of American forces during those critical months of early 1943. The catastrophic defeat at Kasserine Pass, rather than destroying American military effectiveness, became the catalyst for rapid improvement that characterized the American approach to warfare. The willingness to acknowledge failure, analyze mistakes systematically, cashier incompetent leaders regardless of seniority, and implement corrective measures with ruthless efficiency distinguished the American military from more tradition-bound European armies. Rommel's recognition of these characteristics, his evolution from contemptuous dismissal to professional respect, represented one of the war's most significant reassessments of enemy capabilities. The Desert Fox's changed perspective on American soldiers emerged from direct experience rather than theoretical analysis. He had witnessed firsthand the American capacity for learning from defeat, their systematic approach to identifying and correcting deficiencies, their stubborn refusal to accept inevitable defeat despite overwhelming setbacks. These qualities, combined with American industrial capacity and technological sophistication, created an opponent whose eventual victory became increasingly certain as the war progressed. Rommel's professional integrity forced him to acknowledge these truths despite their uncomfortable implications for Germany's war effort. The legacy of Kasserine Pass extends beyond the immediate battle to encompass the broader transformation of American military effectiveness during World War II. The defeat taught lessons that the American Army absorbed and implemented with characteristic efficiency, creating institutional knowledge that shaped American military practice for generations. Rommel's evolving assessment of American capabilities, from initial contempt through growing respect to final recognition of their inevitable superiority, paralleled the broader Wehrmacht experience of underestimating opponents based on preconceptions rather than empirical observation. The Desert Fox learned what the entire German military establishment would eventually discover, that American soldiers, properly trained and led, represented formidable opponents whose national characteristics made them uniquely dangerous adversaries in modern industrialized warfare.